Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It is good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden is urging lawmakers to get on board with his infrastructure plan. At the White House Wednesday, the president pushed back on criticism his proposal is too broad and doesn't focus solely on infrastructure. As we've been reporting on Red and Blue, the approximately $2 trillion proposal includes billions in road upgrades and electric car infrastructure, plus money for clean drinking water, new schools, child care, high-speed internet, and electrical systems. The president says he's ready for negotiation, but is only willing to cut so much.
Debate is welcome. Compromise is inevitable. Changes are certain. In the next few weeks, the Vice President and I will be meeting with Republicans and Democrats to hear from everyone. And we'll be listening. We'll be open to good ideas and good faith negotiations. But here's what we won't be open to. We will not be open to doing nothing. Inaction simply is not an option.
President Biden says he's open to changing his plan when it comes to funding the bill. So far, he's proposed partially undoing the Trump administration's corporate tax cuts. The White House would like to see them raised from 21% to 28%. That's about halfway back to where they were before 2017. The Treasury Department laid out its plan to overhaul the corporate tax code Wednesday. In addition to raising the tax rate, it would prevent companies from shifting profits offshore to pay little to nothing in taxes. The plan also replaces fossil fuel subsidies with credits for clean energy to promote more environmentally friendly power sources. For more, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe and Tamara Keith. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent, and Tamara is a White House correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. Welcome. It is good to see you both. Tamara, let me start with you. It's so interesting to watch this negotiation process unfold now because it feels like a return to something that maybe we haven't seen for a few years in Washington. You start with an opening bid, people express their comfort or discomfort with it, and then the negotiation proceeds. So how much is the Biden administration willing to negotiate on their priorities to move an infrastructure plan forward?
I think certainly they will find it easier. They are finding it easier to contemplate negotiating on just how much the corporate tax is raised over what time frame the plan will pay for itself. But in terms of the definition of infrastructure, they don't seem interested in negotiating on this expansive idea of what infrastructure is, that it isn't just roads and bridges, but that it's broadband and the electric grid and the infrastructure to care for people. They have this much more expansive view, and you can tell that they are working very hard to try to sell this to the American people. It's not clear that this ultimately will be a bipartisan bill. There seems to be a pretty good chance that they'll have to go through that reconciliation process again and do it on Democratic votes alone. But they are trying to be able to say, as they did with the COVID relief bill, that this has bipartisan support, at least elements of it, and they are out there trying to sell it. They don't see this as infrastructure week. We're talking about infrastructure month or infrastructure season in terms of how much they're going to keep trying to push this.
So, Ed, on this concept of the definition of infrastructure, I want to play another clip from President Biden responding to criticism that provisions like child care are not actually infrastructure and shouldn't be in this bill. Here's what the president said.
We don't just fix for today. We build for tomorrow. 200 years ago, trains weren't traditional infrastructure either, until America made a choice to lay down tracks across the country. Highways weren't traditional infrastructure until we allowed ourselves to imagine that roads could connect our nation across state lines. The idea of infrastructure has always evolved to meet the aspirations of the American people and their needs. And it's evolving again today.
So, Ed, as Tamara says, he does seem intent on expanding this definition of infrastructure, or this more expansive definition of infrastructure. But how much of this is driven by the need to pass this as one big bill rather than several smaller ones?
Oh, you nailed it, Elaine. That's a big part of it. The hope that they can try to get most of this done in one big package as part of other proposals that are far more sort of traditional and popular with members of both parties. As the president was speaking there, I double-checked the Merriam-Webster definition of infrastructure. Number one, the system of public works of a country, state, or region. Or number two, the underlying foundation or basic framework as of a system or organization. It's perhaps under Section 2 there that the president can hang his expanding
could be subject to some
definition.
interpretation there, I think.
Yeah, you know, and look, traditionally this is roads, bridges, railways, pipes, electrical grids, broadband. Those are the things that Washington has been focused on trying to do. What they're tacking on here is $400 billion to address the elder care system in this country. The people who, you know, come to your home, take care of your elderly your elderly relatives, and there's concern that those people are not necessarily being paid enough, being properly cared for themselves, and that's a big part of this. That if that kind of care is possible, then the family can go out and do those jobs, and then you're going to see pretty soon proposals that sort of relate to human infrastructure, child care proposals, you know, allowing for free or far more affordable community college education, other changes perhaps to the healthcare system as well. All these things under the auspice of, if we can do this, it will help people be able to do a job or get a job, and, you know, we'll see whether that broader definition holds. Remember, most of the Democratic Party is in agreement with him on this. That's not the issue. It's that small group of moderates and Republicans, and then trying to convince the country that all these things are required to help update the American economy and the American physical and, I guess, societal infrastructure in the view of the White House.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see where public opinion falls on this as the Biden administration's push to kind of sell this plan moves forward here. Well, Tamara, I also want to ask about President Biden's announcement on guns, which the White House says is coming Thursday. What can you tell us about it so far?
I can tell you we're going to learn a lot more in a short period of time from the White House. But you know, the president had pledged to take action on gun violence prevention on day one of his administration. That didn't happen, and he's been under a lot of pressure from gun safety organizations to sign some executive actions. That pressure amplified, certainly after those mass shootings in Georgia and Colorado. And the Biden administration has said, yes, they are working on these executive actions, and we can expect to see likely executive actions and also potentially more in the area of regulatory changes or regulatory shifts. But as they've said all along, those are temporary. Those types of actions come and go with an administration, and they want something more lasting. That would require legislation. Of course, we also know they're very focused on infrastructure, and pushing through gun safety legislation is a heavy lift, which President Biden knows as well as anyone. The crime bill that contained elements of an assault weapons ban, background checks, these items, that was in the early 1990s when he was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Since then, basically the entire gun safety infrastructure of the country rests on legislation that passed in the 90s. Nothing has passed since then, including after Newtown, when President Obama put him in charge of trying to get something through Congress. It got close, and then it completely fizzled out.
Yeah, well, you know, on the topic of guns, Ed, I understand you have some new information about the president's pick to head the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. What have you learned?
That's right. This will be part of the announcement that he makes on Thursday. The pick is a gentleman named David Chipman, a former agent with ATF who served for about 25 years with the agency, and in more recent years has been known as a pretty active advocate and policy expert on the subject of gun control, working with the Giffords gun control organization that was established by the former congresswoman who, of course, was wounded in an assassination attempt back in 2011. He's a widely quoted, often seen on television expert talking about gun violence and gun policy. The president will make that announcement tomorrow at an event that will also include the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. And as Tamara pointed out, this is something he knows well, but this is also something he campaigned on very famously, as he's been reminded in recent weeks. Promised in February 2020 during a campaign stop in Nevada that on day one he would be sending legislation to Congress to help address liability protections that gun manufacturers have and close some other loopholes in the gun background check system. That did not happen, as Tamara pointed out. It's because this administration has been focused so much on fighting the pandemic and the economic downturn, to important, far more perhaps urgent issues, at least in the eyes of most Americans. But he understands that gun violence and addressing it in some way is an issue that is of concern to many voters, predominantly Democratic and independent voters, some Republican voters as well, who see the rash of mass shootings across the country over the last several years as a concern that needs to be addressed, not just through executive action, but also legislation. But again, as Tamara points out, given that they're asking Congress to do about $4 trillion worth of work in the next several weeks, if not months, they know that tacking this on and having a legislative fight over this hot-button issue would be difficult.
Meantime, Ed, we heard Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell appear to walk back his criticism of corporations getting involved in politics after Delta, Coca-Cola, and Major League Baseball came out against Georgia's voting law changes. Here's what he said in Kentucky.
I didn't say that very artfully yesterday. They're certainly entitled to be involved in politics. They are. My principal complaint is they didn't read the darn bill. They got intimidated into adopting an interpretation of that given by the Georgia Democrats in order to help get their way. And what did it cost them? It looks like it cost them the All-Star game. And Major League Baseball made the same mistake. They didn't read the bill.
So, Ed, how significant is that, and what does it say about the relationship between Republicans and big business at this moment?
Well, as even Tamara can agree, any kind of an explicit walkback from Leader McConnell is notable. He doesn't do that too often.
Yeah.
And I imagine he may have heard from some of his more generous corporate donors who said, oh, you'd like us to get out of politics? Well, then I guess I'll close my checkbook to you and your party, too. So I think he understood there he had some cleanup to do with people who have been generous with their cash in the past. And you saw there, he remains concerned and opposed to what Democrats are up to by opposing this Georgia voting rights bill, and the focus that's underway in Texas, a state that very well may pass a more aggressive, more expansive election law or changes to their election laws in the coming weeks. But, you know, the rift between Republicans and corporations is one that's been growing over the last 4 years. I think has been accelerated now, certainly since the latter half of the 2020 campaign, when there was concern about big technology companies trying to, control what was being said or shared on social media platforms. And now, of course, these boycotts or bans and decisions to pull out of certain states, which is not new. You know, we've seen this in the past. A few years ago, remember, there were the debates over transgender bathroom bills in states like North Carolina, where companies and sports leagues stepped in and said, if you're going to do this, we're getting out of the state. So corporate pressure in the past has had a way of influencing legislative debate, as does other pressures. And it's happening here again. Republicans, though, clearly a little more torqued up about this one because they understand that for Republican base voters, this remains a very big concern. And in many ways, they believe they're enacting legitimate changes that help erase a lot of the doubts about how elections are run. Obviously, Democrats feel quite differently about that.
On another topic, Tamara, CBS News has confirmed reports that Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz asked former President Trump's White House for a blanket pardon months before we learned of a reported sex trafficking investigation against him. Now, President Trump issued a statement denying it this morning. But Tamara, as someone who has covered the Trump White House, can you just give us a sense of the broader context with respect to denials? What has been sort of the pattern and practice, if you will, when it comes to denials in the past?
Often there have been denials that have not been true at all or reality-based at all. And in this case, the denial is that Gaetz didn't come directly to the president. It's not as expansive as potentially, Gaetz may have asked someone else, or who knows. But there is a narrow path where the former president's statement could be true, and that all of the reporting about Matt Gaetz asking for a blanket pardon could also be true. And more broadly, just as a reminder, towards the end of the Trump administration, it was it was like open shopping season with lots of people jockeying to get pardons, to get these presidential pardons before he left office. And frankly, throughout his time in office, he used the presidential pardon in a way that presidents normally don't do when they're trying to run for re-election or otherwise want to remain in politics, using the pardon to help political friends and allies. So it was part and parcel of the way former President Trump used his pardon power to help people that he likes or thought got a bum rap.
All right. On that note, Ed O'Keefe, Tamara Keith, great to see you both. Thank you very much.
Take care, Elaine.
You're welcome.